I'm Robert Haas of Michigan Atheists, and this is Atheists Speak Up. With me, I have Norm Cohen. Norm is the director of an organization called NOCIRC of Michigan. Norm, what is NOCIRC of Michigan? What purpose does this organization serve, and who does it serve?
Well, NOCIRC is the National Organization of Circumcision Information Resource Centers. It was started in 1986 by a nurse in California. I got involved in 1994 and started the NOCIRC of Michigan chapter. I am the state director. We offer information on infant circumcision to parents and to healthcare providers, men, anyone else that's really interested in the topic of circumcision. We believe that we are providing an important service of educating the public about circumcision and about its effects.
What's the history of circumcision?
Well, circumcision has a very long and strange history. It's about 6,000 years old. It originated in Africa, the same part of the continent where female genital mutilation is still practiced today. It predates Judaism. We have archaeological evidence that the Egyptians were practicing circumcision at least 1,500 years before the Jews. It turns out that the Jews were enslaved by the Egyptians and probably were forcibly circumcised by the Egyptians. We read, though, in Genesis 17:11 that circumcision was a covenant, as a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham, that the circumcision would ensure that the Jewish people would inherit the land of Israel. But what actually probably happened is that the Jews who had been forcibly circumcised all those years in slavery transformed the forcible, degrading practice of circumcision on the adult males to an initiation rite into the Jewish people, if you will, by circumcising children at 8 days old. And that's what was written into the Bible, and that's how the practice arrived to the Jews today. I think that around the world, though, circumcision is an initiation rite. It's a tribal custom that has been performed in a variety of times and places to initiate the boy into the tribal patriarchy of the civilization which he lives in. But it's important to realize that even today only 20% of boys are circumcised, 80% of boys are intact, that is, that they are not circumcised. Now you might wonder, well, how did circumcision arrive in the United States in such great numbers? Well, previously it had been the Jews and then the Muslims that had picked up the practice from the Jews. But what happened in the United States in the 19th century, we went through the Victorian era when there was a great deal of anti-sexual hysteria. When anything having to do with sexual pleasure was a sin, was something that needed to be controlled and suppressed. And this took root in all of the English-speaking countries around the world. In the United States, there were several doctors that experimented with little boys, circumcising them, claiming that they had produced cures. Because these little boys had been caught masturbating, they thought that by eliminating this sinful practice, because after all, sexuality was a sin, was a vice, by eliminating this, it would reduce the incidence of disease, which was believed to be some form of punishment for your vice. The idea that circumcision is cleaner came from that as well. It was the moral cleanliness that they were after, the moral purity that they thought that circumcision would provide by making it more difficult for little boys to masturbate. And so we have many records of doctors publishing dramatic cures of little boys that had suffered from epilepsy, hernia, shyness, all sorts of realm of diseases. And then they said, well, after the circumcision, they miraculously were cured. John Harvey Kellogg out of Battle Creek was a big proponent of circumcision in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Along with all of his other fanciful cures that were pseudoscience, he recommended routine circumcision. This would both prevent a boy from straying, from being led astray by his penis and his urges, and keep him physically clean. He felt the two went together. Then later on, of course, when births were very common in hospitals, the circumcision rate rose dramatically because it was being done now in the hospital for the same reasons of this idea of cleanliness. It was being done routinely, about 50% of all the births by 1920. When the GIs went off to war, they said, well, they'll be cleaner if they're circumcised, they'll be less prone to sexually transmitted diseases if they're circumcised. But the original thinking was that sex was dangerous and that by circumcising we would somehow mitigate the dangers of human sexuality. After World War II, the GIs came home and they would circumcise their little boys. So by 1960, 80, 90, 95% of boys were circumcised routinely in the hospitals. And it was only until the late 60s when they were actually asked, the parents had to consent to the surgery. So at the peak of the circumcision craze, at about 95% in 1971, the American Academy of Pediatrics looked at this phenomenon of circumcision and realized, based on the medical evidence, based on the studies that had been published, that there was no medical reason to do circumcision. But by then, the vast majority had already been circumcised. So what started as this strange pseudoscience, this strange quasi-religious medical practice, now became a social custom because all these boys and their fathers were being circumcised. It just became a way of matching everyone else. It had no science behind it, but everyone wanted to look alike, so we continued the practice of circumcision.
But doesn't it help the penis stay cleaner and reduce your chance of catching a disease?
No, circumcision is without precedence in the medical experience because there's no other part of the body that we would cut off. A healthy, normal, functioning part of the body we cut off and claim it's cleaner, or claim it looks nicer, or claim that it's a preventative. There's no other part of the healthy body that we would just simply cut off. It's only the foreskin. It's the only part of the body that parents can ensure a doctor will cut off. Normal tissue can ensure and ask and insist that a physician remove part of their baby's body. It's without precedence.
Well, why are you so opposed to the practice of circumcision then?
Well, somebody needs to speak out against this, or else the ignorance continues against this practice that we just follow as drones. Parents, moms, and dads come to me and say, I wish I'd had this information prior to having submitted my son to a circumcision because I saw the circumcision. I saw how he was strapped into the circumstraint board. I saw how he was given no anesthesia and he struggled against the restraints. This is a very painful and traumatic experience for the little boy. There's no reason to put little boys through this, but parents are not being given the information in advance. The physicians just simply say, well, do you want him circumcised or not? They don't have the time, they don't spend the time to inform parents about the procedure prior to asking them to sign it. They actually solicit the surgery. The parents often don't bring it up because they're distracted by all the other events of pregnancy and birth. And it's the hospitals that bring it up and say, do you want him circumcised? Your insurance will pay for it. You just sign here. It's just too easy for them to cave in to the status quo. So there needs to be an organization out there. And in Michigan, it's NOCIRC of Michigan. We are the only ones speaking out for the general integrity of these babies. We are the only ones that are providing information at no charge to parents and to healthcare providers well in advance of having to make this critical decision for the newborn. It is the very first abuse that we put children through. You know, right after birth, within the first day, they suffer needlessly from this surgery.
Well, why is the practice so controversial then?
Well, because for one, it is a religious practice among Jews and Muslims. There are some Christians that erroneously believe that because Jesus was circumcised and because it is mentioned in the Old Testament, that they too must be circumcised. So I have Christians come to me, I have Baptists come to me and say, well, it's part of my religion, I have to circumcise. And in fact, there's more fundamentalist Christians that cite religious reasons for circumcising than there are Jews in this country that do it for religious reasons. So there's a lot of ignorance out there, and we have to educate everyone on the facts of the matter, the historical record, the religious issues. It is a very controversial issue because there are some parents that still believe that they have a right to modify the healthy body of their child. This is a human rights violation. The children are not their property. They cannot willy-nilly just cut things off of their body. They cannot put a child through suffering. There's no compelling medical argument that can be made for the circumcision. There's nothing wrong with the child. There's no diagnosis. So how is it that parents can walk into a hospital and have part of their baby boy's penis cut off?
Well, what then would you say to parents who are thinking about having their son circumcised?
Well, I think they should educate themselves first, because most parents have only the best intentions in mind for their child. They don't want to put their child through any sort of unnecessary traumatic experience. Whether or not they remember it or not, it is a painful experience. I want to show you a couple of the clamps that are used. This is the Gomco clamp. This is the one that's most commonly used by the hospitals for a little boy who's just been born, and the foreskin is trapped within this device and applied for about 5 minutes to cut off the flow of blood, and then a scalpel is taken to the foreskin and it's cut off. Mm-hmm. It's thrown away in medical waste. This is just a tragedy. There's no purpose in doing this. This is another clamp. This is a scissors clamp called the Mogen clamp, commonly used by the Jewish ritual circumcisers, the moil. The moil comes to your home. He's not licensed typically to practice circumcision. He's usually a non-physician. He's not regulated by the state of Michigan. So if there's any complications to this surgery, there's no one to complain to. Again, a very painful procedure, disfiguring, and dangerous device.
That's amazing that you need a license to give someone a haircut, but you can perform that kind of surgery without a license?
Right, and because it is a religious practice among the Jews, it has been given a special status of silence where the regulators, the licensing boards in every state don't want to get involved in this religious practice, and that's what has protected it, even though tattoo artists and barbers have to be licensed. The moils apparently are exempt, and unfortunately we've seen in the last few years in New York City 2 baby boys died of herpes that was transmitted from the moil to the baby. Is a deadly disease in babies. The New York City was very reluctant to get involved because it was a religious practice. They were very reluctant to regulate the process and try to make it safer. And we believe that regulation and accountability is essential for regardless of the reason that you would perform this.
Okay, well, let's suppose parents decide not to circumcise their son. What then should they know about that?
Well, first of all, he's not going to be the only boy in his class that's not circumcised. The circumcision rate continues to decline. It has been declining since 1971. We follow the statistics very carefully. In the U.S., 55% are still being circumcised, but that rate continues to drop. In Michigan, because we're in the Midwest, the circumcision rate is higher. It's about 80%. The Midwest is slower to change for a variety of reasons, but we do feel that the circumcision rate will be declining in the future. There's a great number of immigrants coming from other countries that do not practice and have never practiced circumcision, and this is going to have an influence on the procedure. Remember, most of the world does not circumcise. 80% of the world is intact. So when they look at what's going on in the rest of the world, when they look at Europe, when they look at Japan, South America, most of Asia, that's for non-religious reasons, they realize that they're not circumcising. And it is because there is no medical reason to do this surgery. They're protecting their little boy. As guardians, the parents do not have a right to modify the healthy organs of a child, to fashion them into how they think that they should look. It's only circumcision that is able to escape the scrutiny of organizations like Amnesty International, the American Humanist Association, who refuse to condemn this as a human rights violation.
Okay, well, let's suppose you don't have your son circumcised when he gets older and has gym class and has to disrobe in the locker room. Doesn't he have to worry that he won't look like the other boys in class?
Well, he will look like some of the boys because, as I said, many of them will be intact. This is not as big of an issue as we fear. It comes up in the conversation of parents, but what we find is that peer pressure relates to many other dynamics that go on between teenagers and personalities. And a young man can be taught to have pride in his body, to embrace his individual differences, that he does not have to succumb to peer pressure on any level, whether it's taking drugs or whether it's being circumcised. It's just nonsense to think that he has to look like everyone else.
But what would you say then to a doctor who insists on circumcising otherwise healthy boys?
Well, the doctors really need to look very carefully at their oath, which is first, do no harm. And they are harming these boys at the request of the parents. They shrug it off and say, well, the parents asked for it and that's why I did it. I wouldn't do it without their permission, but they've asked for it. And then I say, well, did you provide informed consent? Have you told them all of the risks and complications of this painful procedure? Have you told them that there are about 50,000 men out there that are restoring their foreskins because they are very angry at having been circumcised? Did you tell them about the loss of sexual function that will result when you cut off 1/3 of the skin of the penis? There's no organ in our human body that we can just cut off parts of and expect that organ to behave and to function just as if it had never been modified. The simple science will tell you that there is going to be a change, that we are censoring the sexual experience of the human male by circumcising him. It's done without his permission. This cannot be allowed to continue, but it's the doctors that continue the practice. They make between $250 and $350 on every circumcision, in addition to the hospital charges. This is a moneymaker. It's a 15-minute procedure, and there's no reason for them to stop. It takes longer for the doctors to explain everything that I've been explaining than to just say, well, here, sign this form and I'll circumcise your boy in 15 minutes. So it's something that parents need to take charge of, that parents need to go out, find the information, contact NOCIRC of Michigan, and get informed, realize that most of the world has never practiced this procedure, that never will practice the procedure, that there's no medical reasons to do it. So why do it?
Well, what would you say then to men who already have been circumcised, especially to dads who've been circumcised?
Well, I get calls from a lot of men that are angry at having been circumcised. And they come from teenage boys and middle-aged men and old guys. They're all realizing that someone, without their permission, robbed something from them when they were born, and now they're facing the aftermath of that and trying to piece together what happened to them. Why is it that as they're getting older, they're losing sensitivity in their penis, they're losing some sexual functioning, some sexual enjoyment? Why is it that their parents allowed this to happen? For a father, he has to look at himself and say, well, no, I was circumcised, but that doesn't mean my boy has to be circumcised. Yes, I don't remember the procedure. Yes, I'm still functioning sexually as a man, but why should I put my boy through this just so that I can feel good at having been circumcised all those years ago? Because the dads want the boys to look like them. There are other dads that say, wait a minute, this is not something that I want my boy to experience, even if it was done to me. I don't want to do it to my little boy. It is not my right to cut things off part of his body. So we have more and more fathers that are taking charge of this and saying no to the doctors, no to the misinformation and myths about this, no to the religious influence that said, well, this has been a practice among the Jews for 4,000 years. It must be good enough, But it is not. It is not good enough in this day and age when we have come to respect and appreciate our own human sexuality.
Right. Well, what's the big deal then of having a foreskin? Doesn't a circumcised penis serve its purpose as well as an uncircumcised one?
Well, of course, if you're circumcised, most men don't have problems as a result of their circumcision. But there are enough and significant numbers of men that do. Remember what I said is that there's no part of your body that you can cut off and expect the rest of your body to behave, to perform the same as if it had never been modified. So that is true with the penis. The foreskin is 1/3 to 1/2 of the skin system of the penis. It is highly innervated. That is, it has many nerve endings that are specialized to the sexual response. These are receptors that are fine-tuned over the period of evolution to receive stimulation. And while a man who's circumcised can still also receive the stimulation, the foreskin itself contains those nerve receptors in greater abundance, in greater density than any other part of the penis. And this is the part that we're cutting off and throwing in the garbage can. The foreskin covers the head of the penis when a man is not sexually active, acting as a glove. It protects the end of the penis from abrasion, from the normal wear and tear, and from the thickening of the skin that results in a desensitization of the head of the penis. So men who are angry enough actually choose to restore their foreskins.
What is this practice of foreskin restoration then?
It's a wonderful practice of trying to restore some of the function that the foreskin, the original function of the foreskin, would have provided. Now, it may sound strange to some that men would be doing this, but remember, they're just trying to get back what they had, right? They're not piercing or tattooing or altering in some unnatural way. They're trying to restore what they had when they were born. I had one man say, well, I was born with a foreskin and I'm going to die with a foreskin. And the reason is because they've come over the years to recognize that the foreskin would have protected the end of their penis, that would have provided additional sexual sensitivity, that would have been used during the process of intercourse as a natural lubricating part of the penis. As a result of this, at least 50,000 men in the United States have or are restoring their foreskin. Foreskin restoration is actually centuries old. Probably the first man who was circumcised wanted to grow it back because of the functions that I'm talking about. In modern times, we use skin expansion techniques to grow new skin, natural, normal skin, your own skin, on the end of your penis. And we use the same techniques that a dermatologist might use when he grows a skin graft. We put the skin under continuous tension, thereby, over periods of months, grow new skin cells. And this is just the same skin that you'd have on other parts of your body. You can actually manufacture new skin cells. It produces a sheath that in all intents and purposes looks like a foreskin, provides the same protection, the covering of the end of the penis. Unfortunately, those nerve receptors, those highly specialized nerve endings that we had discussed, will not grow back. Unfortunately, that has been lost. But men do report an increased sensitivity during the foreskin restoration process, which I might add is permanent. They report better mechanics to sexual intercourse, a more smoother, delightful experience.
How can we get more information on this subject?
Well, please visit our website. It's www.nocircofmi.org, or you can call the office, 248-642-5703. I'd be happy to provide information and pamphlets. To healthcare providers, we offer free pamphlets at no charge for them to hand out to their clients.
Okay, Norm, thanks for your time on talking on this sensitive subject, but one that I think really does need to be addressed.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay, that was Norm Cohen of NOCIRC of Michigan, an organization that is opposed to forced circumcision of baby boys. Thank you for watching.
The Michigan Atheists State Convention will be held November 17th, 18th, and 19th at the Holiday Inn, Livonia West. Included in our speakers is Michigan's own Dr. Gregory Forbes, Professor of Biological Sciences and Civic Libertarian of the Year. From Virginia will be Mr. Rick Wingrove, American Atheist Capitol Hill Representative and Virginia State Director. And also from Virginia will be Ms. Ellen Birch, a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and atheist activist. And from California, Dr. Michael Newdow, atheist, lawyer, medical doctor, and entertainer. Beyond speaking at our convention, Dr. Newdow will perform for us at our luncheon on Saturday. On Friday, we will have a welcoming dinner party for our speakers, and on Sunday, we will visit Henry Ford Museum to view the exhibit Liberty and Justice for All. I'm Arlene Marie, Michigan State Director, and I hope you will join us for our state convention on November 17th, 18th, and 19th. For further information, please visit our website, www.michiganatheist.org.
Okay, up next, we have Ms. Dee Crowe. As a high school student, Ms. Crowe was committed to a church-related vocation and obtained a master's degree in Christian education from Hartford Seminary Foundation. But at some point, she found herself reciting the Apostles' Creed as, "I used to believe in God, the Father Almighty." It soon became obvious to her that man had created God. She left her job at a Methodist church in Ann Arbor, became a public school teacher, and soon declared herself an atheist. Her continuing desire to educate is reflected in her correspondence to believers who challenge atheists. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Dee Crowe and why it is important to respond to theists.
I am standing up. In a photo album that I was showing to a friend recently, it was a picture of myself sitting next to a man from New York City. We were eating a fabulous barbecue lunch out on deck. And the deck was that of an icebreaker with a Russian crew and a Canadian and Australian staff. The location was off the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula at about 65 degrees south latitude. My Christian friend looked at the caption I had placed under this picture and exclaimed, "How do you guys find each other?" Well, it had only taken a few minutes for us to discover that we were fellow atheists. Normally, it is easier to find each other on an international tour than it is here in the U.S. So I consider it a real treat to be right here in Michigan and meeting so many like-minded people. Arlene Marie asked me to talk about responding to those who question our very existence as atheists and to put an emphasis on education. Well, that's a topic that falls readily into place. My ultimate educational goal has to be a wish at this point. It is that everyone give up belief in the supernatural. Then we would not need to be struggling to keep church and state separate. There would not be victims of religious terrorism. Researchers could concentrate on how to prevent disease and environmental pollution. We humans would have a chance at controlling Earth's population. We have a worldview to sell. Education is on our side. If you will forgive me, I present myself as Exhibit A. Believers are quite surprised when I explain that I am an atheist because of my formal education. My parents encouraged curiosity about things, and we went to books and encyclopedias for answers. In high school biology, chemistry, and physics, I learned the value of the scientific method. This was not in conflict with my family's rather liberal Methodist beliefs. We believed because we thought our tenets of faith were true. Making the search for truth top priority is job one in laying down the road away from theism. But more important to me then was having a sense of belonging. Going to church was enjoyable and important to me. I wanted church work to be my life focus. So off I went to a Methodist university and then on to a mainstream seminary. A lively professor of philosophy at DePaul University had us, like Socrates, digging for truth with questions. Later at Hartford Seminary, we were asking questions about creation myths. In Old Testament studies and again in a class on the Synoptic Gospels, we wrote source symbols like J, P, and Q in the margins of our Bibles to see how oral traditions and fragmented sources got woven together over the centuries by some non-skilled editors with their own axes to grind. Honest Christian education is our ally. The road to atheism is paved with knowledge of religion. However, many people we deal with didn't get it in school. How are we to educate them? Getting in their face to proselytize is unethical. But reacting when the religious get in our face is an opportunity to make our voices heard. Separation of church and state, minority rights, end-of-life decisions, and the teaching or not of evolution are hot topics in the news. And don't you get tired of the prayers recited by victims of natural disasters. Read your paper and respond by writing in. Writing has advantages. There's time to think. There's the opportunity to delete. We can research the topic and be sure of our sources of information. Letters to editors should be in response to something in a very recent paper. Resist the urge to tell everything you want known. Stick to a single topic and delete every sentence that doesn't fit. The Detroit Free Press wants less than 150 words. You can read that aloud in about a minute. Check spelling and grammar. We have a reputation to establish.
Yes.
When we respond to individual questioners, we can be more personal. Keep in mind that giving up faith is too dangerous for some. I think the best way to respond to their anger and suspicion is to be sensitive and respectful. It isn't easy for them to be thinking, what if I go to hell for losing faith? Besides that, a believer may struggle with psychological and social issues. I've been asked, how do you meet people? What do you do in a crisis? How do you deal with sorrow? Prepare your answers. I've been told prayer works for me. How will you reply? How do you find any meaning in your life? Be ready to tell. How can you have any moral values? Be ready to explain. Questioners on many websites are eager to discuss these issues. When a lady from Arlene Marie's mailbox said she didn't care what book I wanted her to read, she wasn't giving up her faith. Well, I gave up on her. As Jonathan Swift said, it's useless to attempt to reason a man out of a thing he was never reasoned into. But perhaps I should have realized that someone like that lady would not continue to write to us if she wasn't interested in what we have to say. Schopenhauer said, all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Secondly, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. Because I hope you will rush home to write letters and emails, I need to conclude with a warning. As phrased by Jose Latour, the surest way to make enemies is to always tell the truth.
Hello, I'm Robert Haas with Michigan Atheists. With me, I have Lee Helms. Lee is the Communications Director of Michigan Atheists. He's also on the Board of Directors, and he is also a practicing engineer. Today, we are going to talk about intelligent design that's being taught in some schools in addition to evolutionary theory. Lee, why are you so interested in this subject of intelligent design? What's the big deal?
I've had a lifelong interest in sciences, and when I heard about the successor to creationism, intelligent design, being taught as science in the schools, I started paying more attention to what was being taught, and it shocked me.
Why did it shock you? I mean, what's wrong with teaching an alternative theory?
First off, there's a general principle at work here. Science tries to explain the unknown in terms of things that are already known, like chemistry, physics, thermodynamics. Pseudoscience tries to explain the unknown by invoking other unknowns, like an unidentified intelligent designer. It struck me as being pseudoscience straight from the start, and to teach pseudoscience in the classrooms is to cheat students out of an education in the sciences.
Why not give the students both sides of the story and let them make up their own mind?
If you follow that argument, then the Sunday school classes should also present this Gospel of Judas, a lot of the Gospels that were not included in the Bible, and let students decide for themselves what they want to believe and what they don't. When students are first learning the basics of a subject, they need to learn what is accepted as being true by the vast majority of practitioners in that subject. And for the sciences, that means mainstream science should be taught first and foremost once they've learned what has already been discovered, how it was discovered, learn about the scientific method, then they can start approaching some of the controversies at the leading edge of science.
Okay. But I've heard that evolution is only a theory. Why not teach intelligent design as an alternative theory?
The problem there is that the word theory is used far more precisely by scientists than it is by the average people, and especially by those who advocate intelligent design. The way scientists use it, theory refers to something that has been fairly well proved by experiment, by observations. Many tests need to be done on the predictions that a working hypothesis makes before that hypothesis can be accepted as theory. The way that intelligent design advocates use the word theory, it sort of means the same thing as speculation. And it's also used very flexibly. On the one hand, science, the science of evolution is just a theory. On the other hand, intelligent design, ours is a theory too. On the one hand, they're playing science down. On the other hand, they're playing intelligent design up, just with this flexible use of the definition of theory. Science is more precise than that.
But aren't living organisms just too complex to have arisen from chance? I remember hearing a sermon once where the pastor was talking about just the odds of one simple molecule that's the building block of life. Just the odds of that molecule forming are 1 out of some horrendously large number, like 1 out of all the atoms in the universe. So how do you explain away the hand of the intelligent designer and claim that life just arose from blind chance?
One good example is the famous Miller-Urey experiment that was conducted back in the 1950s. A mix of water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and ammonia were put into a flask that was sealed up with an electric arc in it. For several weeks, they circulated this water by just a small flame underneath the flask and a condenser on the other side, and this arc worked on it continuously. At the end of the process, they had amino acids, among other things. Once you start adding energy to molecules, and breaking them apart, you're left with free radicals that are very reactive. Unpaired electrons will react very readily with anything that's next to them. The chemicals in the Miller-Urey experiment very naturally fell into a lower energy state by reacting with each other. And that's what produced the chemicals that they saw at the end of that process. Now imagine that process going on for 500 million years and a reactor vessel the size of Earth's oceans with not just electricity, but solar ultraviolet, hydrothermal steam, hot lava, chemicals being washed off the land surface into the oceans. You've got a very complex brew percolating in the oceans for a very long time, and if each molecule reacts even just once a second, there are enough reactions going on to overcome any odds against argument. You might as well argue that if you pick one photon coming from one star and calculate the odds of that particular photon entering your eye, the odds of it happening are so small you shouldn't be able to see any stars at all. Obviously we do see stars. So the odds arguments are irrelevant.
But isn't the body of a living organism just so perfectly formed that it had to have been the handiwork of an intelligent designer?
There's really nothing perfect about any organism. If you look at the human heart, the muscle in the left ventricle depends on a blood supply from the coronary artery, which, as many of us know, tends to get clogged after a certain number of years. A competent designer would not leave an organism that vulnerable to failure of one particular vein or artery. A competent designer would probably use something like the esophagus's swallowing reflex to drive blood through the veins, through the arteries, all the way around the body, so that if one small part of it failed, the rest of the system would still operate.
You know, I've heard a difference between macroevolution and microevolution. Now, microevolution is pretty easy to understand, and you see that all the time. You got bacteria that have become resistant to antibiotics. You got insects that have become resistant to pesticides and so forth, so that's easy enough to understand. But what about macroevolution? Isn't it just too much of a leap to claim that, for instance, a lizard could have evolved into a bird?
It's a case of the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The microevolution of a generation or two has to be carried on over many, many generations, over thousands to millions of years in order to generate new species. Picture a forest with squirrels and a predator that eats squirrels when it catches them on the ground. The squirrels are going to try to jump from tree to tree to avoid that predator. Now, if the environment dries out and the trees start getting farther apart century by century, millennium by millennium, those squirrels are going to have to leap farther. Eventually, they're going to need some kind of a membrane that will help them glide a little bit, like today's flying squirrels. And as the environment continues to dry, they'll have to be able to flap those membranes to extend their leap, and they'll become slow flyers. And then as the environment dries even farther, they'll have to become strong flyers, something like today's bat. It's a very gradual process, and at each step, the squirrels are completely well adapted to their environment. It's just that there is an environmental pressure culling those who cannot leap as far, cannot glide as far, cannot fly as far. That provides a continuous pressure to develop flight.
You keep talking about the environment. Doesn't the Earth's environment point to a loving, intelligent designer who cared enough to create an Earth that is so hospitable to human life?
Only parts of it are very hospitable to human life, mostly the tropics and the southern temperate regions. A human being without parka or any other kind of insulation would not last long in the polar regions. A human being without a jug to carry water would not last long in the desert. There are any number of environments on Earth that are very inhospitable to human life, to other types of life. Each type of life adapted to its own particular niche and seems very comfortable there simply because the organisms that weren't adapted to it died and did not leave progeny. The process of natural selection drives each species to adapt to its environment, and as that environment changes, adapt to the changes.
Well, but if we evolved from monkeys and apes, why is it that there are still monkeys and apes?
That's the wrong assumption. Humans did not evolve from monkeys and apes. Humans, monkeys, and apes evolved from a common ancestor that is no longer living, has gone extinct.
You know, I hear about scientists being afraid of if evidence comes out for intelligent design, you know, that they're afraid they'll lose their job or lose their research funding or something. Don't you think that maybe there's a conspiracy of silence, you know, to keep quiet about all the problems with evolution so that intelligent design doesn't take over?
Science has a self-correcting mechanism called peer review. For every scientist who has a vested interest in preserving the status quo, there's somebody else who has an interest in demonstrating that his own ideas are more correct. It's a matter of sorting out the credibility of the evidence and the processes by which that evidence was developed. Credibility goes to the evidence that best explains the observations. One of the things that struck me about the intelligent design arguments was the way it was argued when I heard the arguments presented live at a talk given by the ACLU in, I think it was Birmingham last November. It was called Science Under Siege. One woman there who was presenting arguments in favor of intelligent design argued very emotionally and presented a scenario that seemed like it was trying to imply some kind of conspiracy among scientists against certain ideas. She claimed that there are 4 different ideas for explaining cosmic redshift, but only one is being taught. And just the way she said it, it sounded like, again, like I say, like it was some kind of a conspiracy. I'm not sure what all 4 of those ideas were, but I think I can figure out 3 of them at least. One was cosmic expansion, which is the accepted theory. One was an earlier theory called the tired light hypothesis, where the thought was that photons traveling across the universe simply became tired like a marathon runner. There is nothing in Maxwell's equations that allows for a photon traveling across space to emit other photons and lose energy, thus becoming tired. So that knocks that hypothesis out. The third one was dust reddening, which is not strictly a red shift, it's selective absorption. Dust particles in space act much like the molecules in Earth's air, selectively interact with shortwave blue light far more strongly than with long wavelength red light. They absorb the blue end and let the red through, which makes starlight look redder, but it's not really a shift. So she had a couple of wrong ideas in there and was just milking them for the sensation value in implying that there's a conspiracy. But there is none. The evidence decides what is accepted. The most credible evidence decides what is accepted.
But aren't there so many problems with evolution that it really takes more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe in intelligent design?
Proposing that life was designed by some intelligent designer doesn't really answer anything. All it does is change the question from where did life come from to where did the designer come from? This is a question that's answered by Occam's razor, which proposes that the hypothesis that is most likely to be correct is the one that makes the fewest and simplest assumptions. Assuming that a complex, intelligent being could arise out of nothing or in some other way is far more complex than assuming that something like quantum mechanics could produce a fountain of protons and electrons called the Big Bang. The Big Bang is a very simple starting point with basic particles and energy and expansion. From there, things progress by gravity and nuclear physics in the centers of stars and chemistry. All of that is known. The only unknown is the actual cause of the Big Bang. And whatever is proposed for the origin of some kind of a designer has to overcome the objection that it's more complex than the origin of a Big Bang.
Now, aren't you just trying to avoid moral accountability by claiming that, since we're just the products of natural processes, that we don't have to answer up to Almighty God for how we've lived our lives?
Moral judgment has nothing to do with being judged by a supernatural being or any kind of supernatural process, supernatural end to life. Humans survive best when they live in groups. Group living requires a certain amount of trust, and maintaining that trust requires restraint on certain behaviors, like you do not kill your tribe mate, you do not steal from your tribe mate, you do not lie to your tribe mate about important matters. Those are the basics of every moral code.
Well, it sounds to me then that just living in harmony with your fellow man, to an extent, it could be considered a survival adaptation, maybe?
It is. When people live in groups, they have more hands available to gather food, more hunters available to hunt game, more people available to spread the work among themselves. One person can take care of a large number of children while the rest are out at work. It's a far more viable way of living than each person as an individual just off on their own trying to provide everything for themselves.
Do you have any closing thoughts? There were some very interesting answers to the questions. Are there any points that I should have touched upon but didn't?
One of the main ideas that advocates of intelligent design rely on is the idea that certain parts of the living organism are irreducibly complex. One that they point out is the bacterial flagellum, which is powered by a small motor that is made out of proteins. It turns out that all of the molecules that perform complex functions have one thing in common. They're very large. DNA and RNA are long-chain polymers of nucleic acids. Proteins are long-chain polymers of amino acids. Now I have here not quite as many items as there are amino acids. I have 6 different possibilities here for combining amino acids. Now, in order for there to be some kind of a limit on the complexity of the molecules that can arise, there would have to be some kind of a limit on the length of these molecules. That would mean there would have to be some kind of natural mechanism that keeps count of how many amino acids have been strung together, and another mechanism that would tell, say, number 101, stop, you cannot join up unless you are added by the guiding hand of a creator or an intelligent designer. There is no such mechanism. Amino acids can link up in solution all day long, as many as they want. They can form very large folded structures and very complex structures. There is nothing to stop them. In order for intelligent design advocates to put their main hypothesis, irreducible complexity, on a scientific footing, they would have to propose some natural mechanism that would limit the length to which proteins can grow. In absence of that kind of mechanism, there is nothing to constrain the size of proteins or the complexity of the functions they can perform. It's just a matter of when a protein arises, if it's useful, it gets used. If it's not useful, it doesn't.
Okay, that was very interesting. You got any closing thoughts for tonight?
Mostly just that everyone needs to be aware of what is being taught in their schools and whether or not it's on a sound scientific footing. As I said at the start, the difference between science and pseudoscience is very easy to discern. Everybody needs to be examining what their children are learning, and they should be concerned that their children are learning science in the science classroom.
Okay, thank you for your time, Lee. That was Lee Helms, Communications Director for Michigan Atheists and our own expert on intelligent design. Thank you for your attention.